What? We're not using the camera, we're not using the screen, and yet there is audio-visual. Yeah? There's audio-visual ready for you all, without the camera and without the screen. And because it starts with the film, I'll let that speak first. What we're after is consciousness and matter and clear definitions. To what extent can we agree on what, in other words, how do we get to the point where we all have the same idea in our minds when we say conscious, or when we say matter, or when we say mind? Because if we're not in agreement on the basic terms we're using, chances are we're passing one another also on the meanings we're looking for. So let's begin by looking at the word consciousness. Two people are going for a walk in the country just outside there, walking along a path, and this is their story.
So we're walking, right?
Yes.
Just stick it between us and then. Okay. Hello, Stephanie.
Hi, Professor. I'm just out from school and waking up to the world.
And how were classes today?
I slept through the last lesson.
Overload?
More like underload, just boredom.
So what was the teacher teaching?
Well, how should I know? I was asleep.
But the lesson was going on all around you. You probably got some of it.
Listen, I was out. I was out. I was awake to nothing. I was unconscious.
Let's see. What were you unconscious of?
Everything. Everything, I mean, all my senses were on off mode, and I didn't know what was going on around me.
And how is that different from when you are conscious?
Are you making fun of me? Or are you being serious?
Did he cut the line there?
No, I'm just wondering
want a
what
reaction?
your response is, because when I'm awake, I can see, I can hear, I can smell things, and I know what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking.
I'm not teasing you. I'm using your experience to get a definition of consciousness.
Well, being conscious means we see, we hear, we feel lots of things in rapid succession, and as each item comes to our attention. So being conscious to me means perceiving what's going on.
Being a professor, right? Let's look at this a little closer. By the way, you just stepped over a big stone on the path.
What stone?
The one you just stepped over.
Oh, I didn't even notice it.
Oh, yeah, my line. Look behind.
But I didn't notice it.
And yet you stepped over it.
But I did it unconsciously. So we are consciously doing things unconsciously. For example, in speaking to you, I don't think of accentuating certain words, and yet I do it. It just comes out that way. It's automatic.
And yet it's intentional in the sense that it is in line with your goal, the meaning you wish to convey. You must have sensed the presence of the stone in order to step over it. And the words you accentuate show the meaning of what you say, so how you speak is not simply automatic. There's some sort of intelligent perception involved.
Well, I'm certainly always gathering information without acknowledging it. Imagine that all that I must be receiving in order to be able to balance on my own two legs, to walk upright, and to stay abreast with your ferocious walking speed. Could you slow down a bit? I'm getting out of breath.
Were you conscious of the somatic signals that made your breathing speed up?
But if I didn't speed up, I'd be half dead or worse.
As we slow down, you might, for instance, become more attentive to the bird sounds all around us.
Well, yeah, they were going on, but I wasn't listening to them. I'm a sedulous student, listening to your conversation.
Enough kidding. But imagine, if the birds went silent all of a sudden, you'd have been very surprised, and would have noticed the change. So you were conscious of the sounds on some level of your being.
Right, I'm getting this now. I receive information about things even though I'm not conscious of them, and not even conscious that I'm receiving that information. I'm not conscious that I'm conscious. What a muddle.
We're aware of a wealth of things without being conscious of them.
But Professor, that's a contradiction in terms. It's like saying I am conscious at the same time that I'm not conscious.
Ah, you've put your finger on it. That's exactly the problem. We use the word consciousness to describe two distinct, incompatible functions.
Well, that's interesting. What you mean is that we refer to two separate activities with the same word.
Exactly. One word, consciousness, has two contrasted meanings. This is a language problem that has to be resolved before entering any discussion on consciousness.
Well, that's really fine, and I do get the point. That there's conscious and awake, and there's conscious and asleep. So where does that leave us?
Yes, there's consciousness and there's consciousness. And the two are not the same. They are two mutually exclusive forms of consciousness.
Oh dear.
To distinguish between these two forms is not difficult.
No, that's better.
In one set, you perceive what you are conscious of. There is always an object present that you recognize.
I get that, and I am conscious of whatever I perceive. For example, I hear your voice, and I hear what you're telling me right now.
And you can equate being conscious with perceiving as long as you use the word perceive in a wide sense so as to include all the objects you perceive in thought as well as what you perceive outside in the world.
In that case, I'd say that I am conscious of everything that I perceive, whether it's present outside or whether it's just in my mind. So, perceiving objects in one form of consciousness. Well, what's the other sort then?
Let's first give a name. Excuse me, a little grammar here. Let's first give a name to the consciousness we've just described. When you are conscious of something, you've formed a concept of that thing.
Yeah, true. I do have a concept of the object that I think of.
It can be precise or vague, but it's always a recognizable thing. Recognizable because you form a concept of it. So let's call this sort of consciousness conceptual consciousness.
I can accept that. Like I said earlier, conceptual consciousness is when I'm conscious and awake.
The way to keep things simple, we can simply use the word consciousness on its own for this. That is, when we simply say consciousness, we refer to conceptual consciousness.
So I'll continue to use the word consciousness, but I'll only employ it, well, only when I mean conceptual consciousness.
That's what I suggest. Now we come to all the rest that we're somehow conscious of, but don't perceive directly.
Yes, all that, though, doesn't form a concept in my mind and isn't an object that I recognise. I've got another example of it. I didn't think of the temperature while we were walking, but I must be conscious of it.
Yes, and if it was a cold day, not like today, we would feel differently, and the whole tenor of our conversation would surely change.
Isn't that the same when something like advertisements influence us without our knowing it? I mean, all those subtle effects that don't become conscious, but still influence our desires and our behaviours.
Yes, the subliminal effects of advertising is a good example of this unknowing consciousness. I don't form a concept of what it is, and I don't consciously think of it, and yet on some level it affects me, and I'm conscious of these features.
So we are looking for a word to refer to non-conceptual consciousness. What about calling it limitless consciousness?
That's good, and it goes in the right direction. Actually, why not simply call it expanded consciousness, because it happens through many sensory channels at once. Nothing restricts what enters our state of being.
Why do you say restricts? What is restricted in conceptual consciousness?
Conscious thinking deals out items one at a time so as to produce the linear process of thinking. Expanded consciousness is not limited to a one-at-a-time process.
And I suppose because there are no defined objects, we can absorb things that are vague and changing and don't have a definite identity. So it must be different from the conscious thought process.
Yes, exactly. Expanded consciousness does not produce recognizable objects, and without passing through our thoughts, information enters our minds and our state of being.
Well, does that mean then that it's subliminal communication? Through expanded consciousness, it seems there's an unlimited amount of information reaching me at any time, and it influences what I feel, what I do and say and think.
Now, to summarize, there is conceptual consciousness in which we recognized what it is we were conscious of, and there is expanded consciousness in which there is no object of perception.
Well, with this, we solve that contradiction that we found earlier of not being conscious and, yes, being conscious at the same time. So I can be receiving influences that play into my expanded consciousness, while my conceptual consciousness knows absolutely nothing of this.
That makes sense. Without this distinction, discussions on consciousness get into a dreadful muddle. So much is simplified when these two different functions are given separate words.
Well, even I can see that this is helpful. But I've got another thought. What is called self-consciousness probably needs to be recognised as having either one or the other of these meanings, because usually when we perceive an object, it absorbs our conceptual consciousness, and our self-consciousness is on the level of expanded consciousness.
Good going. But you're starting a new subject.
Do you mean that our promenade is over?
That's more than enough to consider in what we said. Let's let that settle before going on.
Well, I've really enjoyed working things out step by step in this way. So maybe that lesson in school bored me because it was full of conclusions, and what was left out was the detective work that was needed to get to them. Well, I'll be ready when you are for our next philosophical encounter.
Great. And then until then, have fun and enjoy yourself.
Beautifully. I've nothing more to say. Yes, thank you very much, both of you. That was beautifully done. Yeah? And so, there are two types of consciousness. And we're using one word to refer to the two. And so it's no wonder that books get up to 500, 800 pages about consciousness, and there's not a definition that's clear. And if we're clear about this, then there's expanded consciousness, which is me as an entity relating to everything that passes. It's an experiential level, but it doesn't pass through the mind. It's not formulated into an object. And the other consciousness is conceptual consciousness. And that's consciousness as we most often use the word. I'm conscious of something. And so the question then is, how do we arrive at something? What does it take for the person to be conscious of anything, of an object? This I touched on in other things that some of you have seen. For instance, if I show you, I didn't bring, well, I show you a chair. Immediately you see the chair, or you hear the word chair, and Flash, you know what I'm talking about. You know what it is. What did it take for you to have that instantaneous, apparently, knowledge of what the object is? What made it possible to know that this is a chair? And then we come to a funny situation. In order for that to be a chair, what must you have done? For example, help me.
Learn the word.
Heard it before in reference to that. Yes, unless I'm teaching you a new word and I'm saying this is a galump. Yes, but you'll still get the point. Yes?
Sat down on another chair. So.
Well, to see that as a chair, you have to recognize certain features. That it has a flat bar to sit on, that it has legs, that the relationship between the legs and the height and everything else is, it's not a stool, it's a chair. Yes? So you saw that. Yeah? You noticed it has a back, which probably came to. And so there are a whole lot of features that you integrated in a moment, just to see, just to recognize chair. But actually it doesn't even start, we haven't even started. Because to recognize a chair, you've got to know what sitting is. So you've got to know structures of the body, how you move, what is, yes? And probably when you see chair, there are certain other impressions that come, such as resting or being tired. Yes? If we go on and on, you can see that we can come to 100 things and much more that actually came out to be chair at that instant. How does that happen? If I had to list all these things in my mind, checklist, chair, yes, that won't work. It won't work for two reasons. One, it would never end. And two, I couldn't hold all those things in my mind at one moment. So the conscious mind, that is, the conceptual conscious mind, can't help us to produce the chair we see, the tree we see, anything. Let's take just a square. If I hold up a square, in order to know it's a square, there are relationships that you catch immediately between the lengths and the angles and that it's a closed figure and so on and so forth and other. So there's a fusion of many things at one instant. How does that happen?
Is it imprinted at some level? Like an imprint or something?
If it's an imprint, then the question is, how do we learn? How do we grow? How do we learn things that we don't know before? So somehow, and I actually think that even the things that are imprinted, we go through the process instantaneously. And so something needs to happen, and it doesn't happen in my conscious mind, and the answer is it happens in
subconscious.
In the expanded mind. Yes, and I'll show you why expanded. Yes? So all these things come together. There's a moment of integration, and flash, I have the chair. The coming together, I don't know about, but they are coming together. So the mind, the unconscious mind, or the expanded mind, is working. They have to be simultaneous for me to recognize what the object is. And that moment of coming together simultaneously, I have no way of doing that. And yet it must happen out of consciousness. But the moment the object is formed, in other words, I've created from many a unity, at that instant, my conscious mind wakes up and says, oh yes, there's a chair there. Yes? As if there was nothing preceding the story. And so we have a world full of givens, without seeing that we were intimately involved in producing every single object that we understand.
Imagine.
No. We could go from there to the word mind, yes? Because we can use mind just like consciousness. And so we can talk about the mind and the object of the mind that we're attending to, and the expanded mind, which we know nothing about consciously. But you do know a lot about it. You know, many of you, I'm sure, have had the experience of going to bed with a problem in the evening, or with a question, and waking up in the morning and there it is. What does that mean? That means out of consciousness, our mind, the expanded mind, is functioning with intent and with direction. And so we have this whole realm of the expanded mind that's working for us in parallel together to produce and form the fusion of individual entities, which is what we lap up then afterwards with our conscious mind. Moving, because our conscious mind is essentially linear. We move from one object to the next, to the next, to the next, and we produce an argument or whatever we want, but our thought is essentially linear in the conscious mind. This gives another idea. If the conscious mind is linear, what happens if our mind moves through 2 lines of thinking at once? Or 2,000? The limitation into linearity is what we recognize as the conscious mind. As soon as the conscious mind spreads out, or should I say, creates a Liechtenstein pattern, and it's going in many directions at once. At that moment, the conscious mind calls it unconscious, because it's left out. It can't follow anymore. And we call that the unconscious. So actually, what we are dealing with is consciousness, which is linear, and multi-consciousness, which is the other state of the mind. Who knows, maybe the mind never switches off, and we're working between the 2 planes all the time. Should I, maybe I stop for a moment. Any responses, questions? Because I do want this to be a discussion. If there's anything anyone would like to say before I... Yes, please.
Just a sort of side observation on this.
Yes.
Where you're talking about that thing that we mostly experience, where you go to sleep with something and you wake up with the answer, that is something that was aware, well, Isaac Newton was definitely aware of that, and many of his fellows. And so he used that early part of sleep, where we go through those phases, alpha, theta, etc.
Yes.
He was using those phases when he had a lead ball in his hand. And so as soon as his waking consciousness, if you like, altered into another plane, he could drop the ball, would wake up, and could remember and use that to inform his work and carry it on. So it seems to be, maybe not the same as that, but something like that, where you're going into that altered consciousness, where it becomes available to you, and if you're lucky, it comes through in the morning.
I have nothing to add. I think so, the same as you, I feel. And the question there is, how do you allow the multi-consciousness, let's call it that now, to dawn upon the consciousness? Yeah? And we usually have formed something that we perceive in the mind or outside in order to do that. I should speak up.
2 minutes.
Oh, I see.
Another question.
Right, okay.
Well, and then we break for tea.
Okay. Yes.
What's the role of attention?
That's a beauty that I use usually in seminars with teachers very much. Yeah? And the joke is that teachers don't know the answer. And you say, but did you ever use the word? And of course the report card is all doesn't pay attention, he's not there, and so on and so forth. And then it comes to what is attention. On the conscious mind, we know what attention is actually. But it's defined not by what you do outside, but by something on the inside. Attention is forming in your mind a concept that could be a picture or a word of the object you're thinking about. Inattention is when you're allowing it to pass by and not to register on the mind as a conscious object. That's just a quick answer. It could go further. Yeah? And so, let me see how... yeah, right.
Just a quick one here. It's to do with, am I conscious when I'm dreaming? What I'm thinking is, I'm not aware of my environment around me. So in many ways, I would say that it's a slightly expanded consciousness. But I'm clearly thinking about things and aware of it. So, since this thought process is going on, am I conscious when I'm dreaming?
This is wonderful. I'd love to go. Am I conscious when I'm dreaming? Is the question. And the answer is, as I understand it, is that if you have an object there and you're dreaming of something, you're conscious. Yes. It's a different state of consciousness, but it is consciousness, conceptual consciousness of something. Yeah.
Speaking of dreaming,
Yes.
I don't know if this happens to other people, but I will have dreams and wake up, and I have a slight, very, very slight image of what I was dreaming, but I get very frustrated because I can't remember. What was my dream? I want to tell my husband, I had this, is that typical that when you wake up you can't, I don't know if other people have that, but you can't remember? You knew you dreamed, and you knew it was interesting, or you never got to the exciting end. I wanted to find out what happened, and you wake up and you can't remember?
I suppose that's something that all of you can answer as well as I can, and I've heard that experience. It's certainly very common.
So how do you equate that with consciousness? If I had some sort of consciousness, why don't I remember when I wake up?
Why don't you remember certain things when you are awake that happened is also a question. Yes. And here we move into memory, and there isn't, we leave that out. I did want to go on. Maybe I jumped to two things just to finish. One was I was going to take, I have a list of quotes from Kepler here, who worked on this problem altogether. Because in his great work, yes, the Harmonies Mundi, his masterwork that he wrote in 1619, after he had he worked out the orbit of Mars, and actually just after he came to the third law of planetary motion. Yes. He discusses the idea of harmony, and he says, what is harmony? Maybe I'll even say one quick sentence in here. Yes. And he's talking about two notes, when you hear two notes together. And he points to the fact that it's something else, it's a different, it's not, you're not hearing two notes, you're hearing one thing, which is called harmony. For harmony to exist, this is a quotation, there must be the addition of two sensible terms, that is, two notes. A soul as well, which compares them. For if that is taken away, the soul that is, there will indeed be two terms, just two notes. But there will not be a single harmony, which is a thing of reason. And here we need some more quotes to see how he's working, but actually he talks about racinations, which is you have to understand the relationships and hear them simultaneously. That is the soul's role for him. And we can push that much further because a single note also is vibration. If I tap on the chair, yes, 20, 30 times, suddenly you don't hear a second, you don't hear the taps, and you start hearing a note. Yeah? And we have produced something else. And what I want to show you is that actually we're reading ratios in everything we see. And there's a whole question, do we see objects at all? Or hear, or touch? What we're noticing are relationships. And out of relationships through the unconscious mind that fuses them into and creates an integral moment when the unity comes forth, then we have an object and we call it the object. But did we ever perceive an object? And I don't think so. Yes. This is the other side of the balance, what is matter, and this is how does mind get to matter. And then from there we come to the electric universe, and I must just say one sentence, yes? And the electric universe is, I just lost my train of thought, just a second. And yes, with the electric universe, the move from gravity to electricity is more than might be apparent at the beginning. Gravity is a function, as is understood generally, of matter. And it's even believed more matter means more intensity of gravity. And so, in a world that's built out of objects, and a world that's where matter is supposedly the basis for reality, it's very difficult to let go of gravity and move to electricity, where the size of the particle has nothing to do with the energy, the charge that it has. And so there's a whole movement that's very dramatic in this aspect and many other aspects of the electric universe, where we're actually shifting out of a paradigm very clearly. A paradigm that's much more dramatic than Copernicus, who just made a spatial shift, because here there's the possibility of a temporal shift too, but that's for next time. And thank you for sharing this with me. And thank you to our actors for the wonderful performance.
There'll be a short break now, 15 minutes.